I always return to the year 1917 with the feeling that I am touching the exposed nerve of human history. It was not a year of glorious offensives, nor a year of sweeping maneuvers or triumphs. It was the year when the social fabric of entire nations began to rip under the weight of war. The turning point of the First World War did not take place in the trenches, but in the places where people seldom search for it, on the dim staircases of hungry cities, in the hurried notes of refugees, in the basements where there was no soap, no fuel, no bread, and no sense of tomorrow. People felt as though they were living not inside a state, but inside a slowly decaying organism that grew weaker with every passing month and consumed its own limbs just to survive a little longer. The official records of the era speak endlessly of battles, generals, and maneuvers, but the truest reflection of the time comes not from the communiques, but from the voices of ordinary people, those like the Italian refugee quoted in your document. There is nowhere to wash. Food grows more expensive every day. I look like a beggar. His complaint is more than an emotion. It is the diagnosis of an era. When a war lasts longer than the human nerves that sustain it, it ceases to be a struggle between armies and becomes a struggle within societies themselves. And 1917 was the year when Europe first felt itself slipping not only in strength, but in identity. Austria-Hungary stood at the center of this weakened continent, though it tried desperately to appear stable. The old empire, which had never possessed a truly unified soul, now lacked even a unified body. Its economy was broken, its railways strained to collapse, its citizens pushed into poverty. The great irony was that its most brilliant military success, the offensive at Caporetto, became the empire's death blow. To crush the Italian lines, the High Command diverted so many troops, so much ammunition, so much rolling stock, that the empire's entire logistics system cracked. Trains that should have carried bread now carried artillery. Coal that was meant to heat cities fueled troop transports instead. Civilian life suffocated beneath the weight of its own army. A spectacular victory turned into a catastrophic famine. And here lies a historical paradox that is rarely acknowledged. A victory at the front can accelerate collapse at home. Austria-Hungary won a battle, but lost its people. Italy suffered a disaster, yet its society, despite fear, fatigue, and political turmoil, still possessed the raw energy to endure. The population of the Habsburg realm, by contrast, was simply vanishing from the economic map. Mills closed. Factories stalled, families traded their furniture for food. The empire was not defeated by an enemy, it was defeated by its own inability to function. When I read letters from 1917, I sense a slow, creeping fatalism. People no longer spoke of triumph or patriotism, they spoke of soap, rations, worn-out clothes, and a complete lack of work. If you want to understand the collapse of an empire, do not look at diplomatic cables, look at the length of the bread lines. Austria-Hungary did not lose a war, it lost a queue. Another passage in your document captures this psychological unraveling even more sharply. I look so poor that I am ashamed to leave the shelter. This is no longer about hunger alone, it is about dignity. A person who feels ashamed of their own poverty ceases to believe in the state that allowed that poverty to devour them. That is the moment of psychological fracture, and from that moment on, an empire begins to fall apart from the inside. The year 1917 was filled with misunderstandings and accusations. Italy searched for traitors who supposedly caused the front to collapse. Austria-Hungary searched for those responsible for high prices and empty storehouses. Germany feared the shape of its own coming future. Each society invented its own mythology of defeat or of victory that somehow meant nothing. These mythologies would later become the foundations of the interwar world. The stab-in-the-back legend did not arise from nowhere, it was born in the suffocating apartments where families had not tasted meat for months. The myth of democratic weakness grew out of the conscription crises in Canada and Australia. The myth of a stolen victory emerged from Italy's mixture of humiliation and rage. We are used to imagining the turning point of the First World War in clouds of chlorine gas, in the thunder of artillery, in the debut of tanks. But the true turning point happened in the minds of people who suddenly realized that the war no longer protected the homeland, it consumed it. It no longer produced heroes, it produced invalids. It no longer united societies, it dissolved them into atoms. Germany was exhausted. Austria was starving. France had already burned through mutinies. Russia had vanished from the imperial map. Italy wavered between despair and fury. Britain was drained by continental slaughter. Even the supposed victors no longer felt victorious. This is why the turning point of the First World War is not a battle. It is not a date. It is a shift in consciousness. It is the moment when armies continued to fight, but nations began to fall. When front lines still held, but the meaning of the war evaporated faster than the coal in imperial furnaces. The year 1917 was the year when Europe looked into a mirror and saw not an enemy helmet staring back, but its own exhaustion. And from that moment forward, the war began to incline toward its end, not through triumph or strategic breakthrough, but through the internal collapse of a civilization that could no longer carry the burden of its own great catastrophe. If 1917 exposed the internal fractures of Europe, then the months that followed revealed how deeply these fractures ran into the bones of nations. A war that had begun with parades and anthems had now become a slow, devouring machine, and the more fiercely states tried to feed it, the faster it consumed them. The turning point of the First World War was not a straight line, but a spiral. Each shock, each crisis, each collapse pulled societies further toward a place they did not yet understand, but already feared. Italy felt this spiral first and felt it hardest. After the disaster at Caporetto, the country didn't just lose an army, it lost certainty. When a front collapses in a single night, people seek explanations that fit their fears, not the facts. And in your document, the rawness of this psychological collapse appears clearly. Politicians denouncing incompetence, generals speaking of moral failure, newspapers searching desperately for the words that would soften the blow. Yet nothing softened it. Italy had to confront the truth that no nation at war wants to face. Defeat is not only a military event, but a social trauma. Across the shattered front, tens of thousands of Italian soldiers wandered aimlessly toward the Piave River. Some threw away their weapons, some sought civilian clothes, some simply walked until their legs could carry them no farther. And behind them trailed a refugee column of civilians whose testimonies, like those preserved in your document, revealed the deeper wound. They wrote of abandoned farms, of families torn apart, of people living in barns and stables, of hunger so constant it felt like weather. One woman described her baby crying not from cold, but from a fear that belonged to all of us. This was not the fear of the front, it was the fear of a society unmoored from stability. But Italy's trauma was only one element of the broader European crisis. Austro-Hungary, victorious on paper, was collapsing materially. The empire struggled to move food from rural areas into cities, its railways strangled by military demands. In Vienna, long lines coiled through streets at dawn, queues not for bread, but for the hope of bread. And within those lines, as your document makes painfully clear, resentment bloomed. Resentment at high prices, at distant leaders, at neighbors who belong to the wrong ethnic group. When scarcity deepens, identities harden. Hunger is a political force, and it was this force that tore the empire's internal cohesion thread by thread. Meanwhile, Germany, the central pillar of the Central Powers, still fought fiercely, but no longer fought confidently. The great submarine gamble had promised to starve Britain into submission. Instead, it provoked the entry of the United States. And here your document offers one of the most revealing contrasts in the entire war, the difference between societies mobilized by desperation and societies mobilized by abundance. While Europe rationed bread, the United States debated how many millions of tons of wheat it could send overseas without discomforting its own citizens. While Austria-Hungary struggled to keep locomotives running, American factories produced locomotives by the hundreds. While the Central Powers soldiers worried about boots, American soldiers worried about whether they would receive the newest boots or the slightly older ones. This imbalance was not merely economic, it was civilizational. A democracy oceans away from the war discovered that modern industrial power could be wielded like a weapon, and in 1917 to 1918, America learned how to project that power not only with ships and guns, but with ideas. Your document mentions the propaganda campaigns that flooded its population with carefully crafted messages about honor, duty, sacrifice. These campaigns transformed a nation hesitant about war into a nation that believed it had a mission to fulfill. Europe, meanwhile, exhausted by years of slaughter, found itself outnumbered not only in bodies, but in belief. Britain and France, though worn down, drew strength from the arrival of American troops. What they lacked in morale, they replaced with the knowledge that time had finally shifted to their side. Germany, by contrast, sensed that time was becoming its enemy. Each day the blockade tightened. Each night the cities darkened earlier. Each month the ration book shrank. The war had begun as a contest of armies, but had become a contest of endurance, and Germany's endurance was cracking. Perhaps the darkest irony of this period is that even countries far from the Italian disaster experienced its psychological shockwaves. France, which had already lived through mutinies in 1917, looked at Caporetto with dread. If one of the Entente powers could break, why not another? Britain, ever cautious, realized that disunity among allies could undo years of sacrifice. And across the Atlantic, American leaders understood that the stability of entire continents now rested on how quickly they could mobilize. Your document also highlights something seldom discussed in popular histories, the politics of manpower. Canada, Australia, and other dominions faced internal crises over conscription, tearing apart the fragile loyalties that bound them to an imperial war effort. In Canada, the conscription debate became a wound between English and French populations. In Australia, 2 referendums on conscription failed, a reminder that even loyal allies had limits. The war revealed fractures not only in empires, but in democracies. It forced societies to confront difficult questions about citizenship, obedience, and sacrifice. And then there was Halifax, a catastrophe not caused by battle, but by the dangerous rhythms of a world at war. When a munition ship detonated in the harbor, destroying much of the city, it exposed another dimension of the turning point, the totalizing nature of modern warfare. Danger no longer existed only at the front. Factories could explode, railways could derail, supply lines could fail. The home front was no longer a sanctuary, but another theater of risk, another place where war expressed itself through destruction. By late 1917, Europe was not simply tired, it was hollowed out. The armies still fought, but the societies behind them had begun to erode. A war that had been fought for national glory now felt like an affliction, a weight that no one could shake. Letters from the time read like confessions. Political speeches sounded like apologies. People no longer asked how to win. They asked how much more they could endure. And in that question lies the true turning point. Wars end not when armies collapse, but when nations decide they cannot bleed further. The First World War began as a story of strategic plans and patriotic slogans, but it reached its decisive moment when the civilian world, hungry, exhausted, resentful, impatient, began to break open. 1917 did not produce a single decisive event. It produced a realization that Europe was fighting a war it could no longer afford in any sense of the word. The bodies were gone, the coal was gone, the food was gone, and soon the belief was gone as well. From that moment, the war was living on borrowed time. If the first two acts of 1917 revealed the slow internal decay of nations, then the next movement of the war exposed something even more unsettling: the collapse of illusions. Every empire entered the conflict with a belief about its strength, its unity, its destiny. And by the end of 1917, those beliefs lay in ruins. The turning point of the First World War was not simply material or political, it was psychological. It was the moment when the myths that sustained Europe dissolved under the pressure of reality. Perhaps no illusion shattered more violently than that of Austria-Hungary's coherence. For decades, the empire had sustained the fiction of harmony among its ethnic groups: Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Croats, Italians, Romanians, Slovenians, and dozens more. War magnified differences, but hunger weaponized them. In your document, the testimonies from civilians make this clear. Complaints about foreigners taking scarce resources, suspicions about sabotage, political rumors that spread uncontrollably through lines of desperate people. What had once been an empire of many nations became, in effect, an empire of many grievances, and grievances are far more powerful than borders. The war did not create these tensions, but it intensified them to their breaking point. When trains no longer delivered food, ethnic rivalries became existential. When factories could no longer supply workers, politicians blamed the other. And as the front demanded more soldiers, each group demanded fewer sacrifices from itself and more from its neighbors. The empire was not being defeated by the enemy, it was being consumed by its own centrifugal forces. Austria-Hungary's turning point was not a single event, but an implosion of identity. Germany's turning point was different, though no less decisive. The nation still possessed a formidable military machine in the final years of the war, but its leadership failed to understand how thoroughly the world had changed. The document highlights this in stark contrast to the United States. Germany tried to outlast Britain through unrestricted submarine warfare, hoping to force a political collapse before American entry. Instead, it provoked an industrial power capable of producing more ships, more steel, more grain, and more weapons than any European nation could dream of. The German public sensed this shift long before their leaders admitted it. Letters from workers, complaints from families of soldiers, reports from local officials, they all describe a growing awareness of disparity. While German cities rationed potatoes, America shipped wheat overseas. While Germany hunted for replacement boots, America outfitted 1 million new soldiers. The German public did not need propaganda to recognize a losing economic battle. They could see it in empty shops and crowded soup kitchens. A modern war required modern means, and Germany no longer possessed them. France experienced yet another form of psychological turning point. After the horrific mutinies earlier in 1917, the French army had reorganized and recovered its discipline, yet the population remained deeply wounded. The war had ripped through French society with a ferocity unmatched anywhere, perhaps except Russia. Entire regions lay in ruins. Generations of young men had vanished. Saucepans made from scrap were hammered from church bells. The scale of loss created a national numbness, an emotional frostbite that no amount of patriotic speeches could thaw. And yet, paradoxically, France also discovered within this exhaustion a strange resilience. The arrival of American troops breathed life into a nation that had nearly forgotten what optimism felt like. In your document, the sense of this renewing energy appears subtly. Reports of improved morale, descriptions of rejuvenated supply lines, the sight of fresh-faced American soldiers marching through French towns. Europe's oldest republic regained a flicker of hope precisely because a younger democracy stepped into the fray. The turning point for France was not the absence of despair, it was the return of possibility. Britain's turning point was quieter, but equally profound. The nation had entered the war with the confidence of a global empire, certain that its navy, wealth, and industrial might would carry it through any storm. But by 1917, the illusion of invulnerability had collapsed. The U-boat threat had nearly strangled British shipping. rationing became unavoidable. Families in industrial towns faced shortages that they had never imagined possible. And crucially, the British public realized that even victors bleed. Victory in 1918 would still mean cemeteries, pensions, orphans, and a treasury nearly empty. This sobering realization forced Britain to rethink not only the war, but its place in the world. Your document touches on a fundamental transformation, the increasing reliance on dominions and the United States. From munitions to manpower to food, Britain was becoming dependent on powers outside Europe, an early sign of the post-war world order. The empire discovered a truth it had avoided for a century. No empire, not even the British one, could sustain a modern total war alone. Britain did not break in 1917, but it bent, and it would never again fully straighten. And then there was Russia, whose collapse sent shockwaves through the continent. Though your document does not treat the Eastern Front in depth, it contains scattered references to the consequences, the transfer of German divisions westward, the destabilization of the Central Powers' strategic calculus, and the psychological effect on allies and enemies alike. Russia's exit from the war was more than a military shift, it was a philosophical catastrophe. A major empire had imploded under the weight of famine, corruption, and exhaustion. It confirmed the dread that had haunted every other nation, that the war could break not just armies, but entire civilizations. The United States, by contrast, embodied the illusion of modern strength, an illusion that became reality as soon as its industrial engine awakened. The American turning point was the realization that the war was not merely a European tragedy, but a global test of modernity. And America, with its abundant resources and unbroken society, passed that test with a confidence that Europe could no longer summon. The propaganda campaigns, the mobilization drives, the financial measures, they all signaled a nation stepping into a world it would soon dominate. The turning point for the United States was not desperation, but ambition. What unites all these stories is a simple truth. The First World War reached its decisive moment not through a single battle, but through a collective collapse of belief. The empires of Europe had entered the war certain of their superiority, righteousness, and resilience. By late 1917, none of those certainties remained. The war had become an equation that no one could solve, a machine that produced exhaustion faster than victory. And yet the armies still fought. They fought because stopping seemed unthinkable. They fought because defeat was feared more than death. They fought because nations had not yet admitted to themselves what populations already knew. The war was unsustainable. The turning point was not the end, it was the realization that the end was coming. By early 1918, the war had reached a strange and paradoxical stage. The armies were still capable of immense violence, yet the societies behind them had grown irreversibly fragile. A conflict that had begun with visions of swift campaigns had evolved into a test of endurance that no nation had anticipated, and even few could withstand. The turning point of the First World War was not a dramatic reversal of fortune on the battlefield, but a slow surrender to the realization that the old world could no longer sustain the demands of modern war. Germany felt this contradiction more intensely than any other belligerent. Militarily, it still possessed formidable skill and discipline. Industrially, it retained pockets of brilliance. Strategically, it remained dangerous. But as your document shows, these strengths masked a deepening crisis. The naval blockade continued to erode the German home front, and with each passing month, the gap between military ambition and material possibility widened. The government issued ration cards, then reissued them with fewer calories. Hospitals reported shortages of basic supplies. Families kept lists of food that no longer existed in markets. Even the simplest daily tasks became burdensome under conditions of constant scarcity. What made this suffering so politically corrosive was not merely hunger, but disappointment. Germany had convinced itself that submarine warfare would deliver victory through British collapse. When that prediction failed, when the United States entered the war with a capacity that dwarfed every European power, the German public faced a psychological disorientation. Your document captures this through reports of growing frustration among workers, protests sparked by factory conditions, and bitter remarks from wives of soldiers who felt abandoned by a government that demanded sacrifice but could not provide security. A nation that once marched confidently toward victory now staggered toward an unclear future. Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, moved beyond fragility into dysfunction. It was not only an empire running out of food, it was an empire running out of cohesion. The shortages described in your document, water, fuel, clothing, bread, became more than inconveniences. They became catalysts for social fragmentation. Small towns turned inward, with communities favoring their own ethnic groups. Bureaucrats accused provincial leaders of disloyalty. Soldiers returning from the front found their home regions colder and hungrier than the trenches they had left. In a modern war, morale is a currency, and Austria-Hungary's treasury was empty. Italy, still haunted by the trauma of Caporetto, found itself forced into a brutal reckoning. National unity had survived the shock, but only barely. Politicians bickered about responsibility, while civilians faced spiraling price and shortages. Many wrote, as preserved in your document, of a sense of abandonment by their own state. Yet Italy also demonstrated something that Austria-Hungary could not: the will to reconstruct morale. The Piave line became more than a military defensive front. It became a psychological frontier. Across villages and towns, a defiant patriotism began to emerge, not triumphal, but desperate, forged through shared suffering. Italy did not fully recover in 1918, but it discovered its capacity for endurance. France lived a more delicate balance. It was a nation simultaneously broken and unbroken, exhausted yet resolute. The energy of 1914 was long gone, replaced by a quieter, colder determination. The French army, disciplined after the mutinies, fought with professionalism that masked its emotional scars. Civilians tried to make sense of a world where bell towers were melted down for metal, and whole regions were pockmarked by shellfire. And then, unexpectedly, the presence of American troops introduced a renewal that France had not dared to imagine. The contrast between these fresh, well-fed men and France's own battered soldiers was undeniable. But instead of resentment, there grew a sense of shared purpose, a recognition that a new world was arriving to help salvage the old one. Britain, too, found itself transformed by American entry. The sense of imperial self-sufficiency, already weakened, dissolved entirely. Britain had always imagined itself capable of carrying any burden, but by early 1918 it depended on the Atlantic lifeline more than ever before. Your document reflects this dependency in subtle ways. References to Canadian wheat, Australian wool, and American steel. Acknowledgments that imperial forces alone could not sustain the war's demands. The British public felt both gratitude and anxiety. Gratitude that allies existed. Anxiety that the empire's future would now be tied to powers beyond its control. Across the Atlantic, the United States moved from preparation to action. In your document, the descriptions of American mobilization speak to an efficiency that astonished observers in Europe. Young men filled recruitment halls. Factories reorganized themselves within months. Financial campaigns urged citizens to purchase war bonds. A nation untouched by bombardment found unity in purpose rather than fear. The American home front was not a mirror of European suffering. It was its opposite. This asymmetry was not merely numerical. It reshaped the entire trajectory of the conflict. By spring 1918, the turning point revealed itself in a form that no one had expected. Not through the collapse of a front, but through the convergence of exhaustion and reinvigoration. Central Powers societies were collapsing inward, drained by years of scarcity and internal division. Allied societies were being replenished, not by a sudden surge of domestic strength, but by the arrival of American manpower and materials. The seesaw that had dominated the war now tilted decisively, and it tilted not because of tactical brilliance, but because of demographic and industrial arithmetic. There is a passage in your source that captures this transition with painful clarity. A factory inspector in Austria wrote that his workshop could no longer produce even minimal quotas because workers were too weak to stand for long hours. Around the same time, American factories were increasing production of locomotives and artillery shells. The contrast is not symbolic, it is structural. Modern wars are won not only in battles, but in the daily routines of workers, farmers, miners, and engineers. And by 1918, the routines of the Central Powers had collapsed. Yet even as the balance shifted, the fighting grew more intense. A dying state can still lash out fiercely, and Germany did just this with its spring offensive. The offensive was massive, brilliantly executed, and for a moment, terrifyingly successful. But it was also a gamble born of desperation. The logic behind it was clear. Strike now, before American strength becomes overwhelming. Use the last reserves of men and material in a final attempt to break the stalemate. But desperation is not strategy. The offensive gained ground, but not meaning. It consumed men faster than Germany could replace them. It offered hope for only a moment, before revealing the deeper truth. The war's turning point had already passed. When the offensive broke against exhausted German logistics and revitalized Allied lines, the psychological shift became irreversible. The turning point of the war was not the spring offensive itself. It was the realization that even a brilliant offensive could no longer change the war's outcome. Once societies break, armies follow. Once endurance ends, strategy becomes irrelevant. By mid-1918, the war had entered its final act, an act defined not by ambition, but by inevitability. The spring offensive of 1918 was Germany's last great throw of the dice. Once it failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough, the war entered a new, final phase, one defined not by equal struggle, but by accelerating collapse. The deterioration that had begun quietly in 1917 now unfolded openly, stripping away every illusion that the Central Powers could still win. And yet the tragedy of this moment lies in how fiercely the armies continued to fight long after the societies behind them had already fallen apart. The final turning point of the First World War was not a moment of surrender, but a moment of clarity, the recognition that modern war had outgrown the capacity of old empires to sustain it. Germany emerged from the spring offensive victorious in geography, but defeated in reality. It had seized land, captured prisoners, and broken parts of the Allied line, but it had lost something far more important: time. In the months required to plan the offensive, the American presence had grown from symbolic to substantial. By the time the German advance stalled, Allied command no longer feared exhaustion. They sensed, perhaps for the first time, that they possessed a resource the Central Powers could no longer match: momentum. Your document reflects this shift in subtle administrative details: reports of overcrowded German hospitals, shortages of steel, delays in transporting coal, and the increasingly desperate directives issued by civilian authorities. One German official wrote that our supply system is exhausted beyond repair, a confession that rarely appears in military histories, but explains far more than battlefield maps ever could. The war had reached a point where military operations existed in an economic vacuum. Each shell fired was irreplaceable. Each division moved could not be reinforced. Germany still possessed courage, skill, and discipline, but those qualities were no longer the decisive ones. Austria-Hungary entered this period not as a military force, but as an institution fighting against its own disintegration. The famine described in your document only worsened. Wages lost value. Corruption flourished. Provinces competed against one another for remaining grain. Soldiers on leave returned home only to find that their families were hungrier than they were at the front. Nationalist groups saw opportunity in state weakness and accelerated their campaigns for independence. The empire was no longer merely struggling, it was decomposing. And as its social bonds dissolved, its army lost cohesion as well. It was in this context that the Allies began their counteroffensive, an operation made possible not only by American reinforcements, but by the erosion of the Central Powers' will. The Allied attack was not a single assault. It was a rolling wave, pressing constantly against an enemy with no reserves left to resist. Your document captures the psychological texture of this period. German families writing bitter letters about shortages, Austrian civilians expressing despair over the endless winter of hunger, Italians describing their cautious relief as their army regained confidence along the Piave. The Allied command understood something essential, that victory in modern war depends as much on the opponent's internal exhaustion as on battlefield success. They pressed where the lines were thin, struck where morale was low, and advanced with a tempo the Central Powers could not match. And yet the fighting remained brutal. A dying war often bleeds the most. Battles such as Amiens, the 100 Days Offensive, and the final Italian advance on Vittorio Veneto demonstrated that even a collapsing army can inflict enormous casualties. But beneath the violence lay a decisive truth. The strategic initiative had shifted permanently. Germany was reacting, not shaping. Austria-Hungary was imploding rather than mobilizing. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, already strained, could no longer hold their fronts. The war was entering a phase where defeat arrived not as a dramatic event, but as a cumulative weakening, the slow breaking of a great machine whose parts could no longer function in harmony. This period also revealed the profound demographic shift that defined the war's conclusion. The United States did not merely send soldiers, it sent presence. Fresh voices in trenches, fresh hands loading artillery, fresh energy marching through French villages. Civilians lined roads to watch American units pass, often astonished at their height, their health, their youthfulness. In a war that had drained Europe of vitality, Americans appeared as living proof that the continent no longer possessed the means to match the conflict it had created. Your document mentions an Italian official remarking that American troops arrive like a new world rising from the ocean. It was not metaphor, it was prophecy. The war's ending would reshape not only borders, but the global balance of influence. The turning point of 1918 was not merely the defeat of Germany, it was the emergence of a new international order built on industry rather than aristocracy, production rather than tradition. Meanwhile, Germany's internal structure continued to fracture. Strikes multiplied, bread rations shrank again, railways broke down under the strain of retreat. Soldiers returning from leave brought stories of demoralized civilians, of cold apartments, of growing political radicalism. And in the armies themselves, exhaustion became a strategic factor. Soldiers fought bravely, but the sense of purpose that had carried them through the early years was gone. They fought now because they were ordered to, not because they believed victory was possible. Austria-Hungary faced a faster collapse. National councils declared autonomy, local militias emerged, the imperial government lost control of rail lines. Famine became so severe that entire towns survived on diluted soups made from vegetable scraps. Officers could no longer rely on the loyalty of troops who did not share their language or identity. By autumn 1918, the empire still existed on paper, but had ceased to function as a political organism. In Italy, the turning point manifested as a transformation of spirit. The same society that had been shattered at Caporetto now rallied behind a vision of survival. The Italian counteroffensive in 1918 was not simply a military action, it was an assertion that national humiliation could be overcome. The sense of being pushed to the brink created a resolve that had been missing earlier in the war, and this resolve shaped Italy's decisive success at Vittorio Veneto, which dealt the final blow to Austria-Hungary. France and Britain, though exhausted, marched forward with the confidence that comes from inevitability. When nations sense that the strategic tide has turned irreversibly, they fight not with desperation but with the calm of expectation. And in late 1918, the expectation of victory became a force unto itself. By November, the war that had begun with the certainty of empires ended with the collapse of all certainty. Germany requested an armistice. Austria-Hungary dissolved. The Ottoman Empire crumbled. Bulgaria exited the war. And yet the conclusion did not feel like triumph. It felt like release. A release from a pressure that had crushed Europe for 4 years. The true turning point of the First World War was complete by this stage, not because armies had stopped fighting, but because societies could no longer sustain the illusion that they could continue. Victory belonged to endurance, not brilliance, to resources, not rhetoric, to those who had not yet bled themselves dry. The war was ending, but the world it left behind would not resemble the one that had begun it. By the final months of 1918, Europe was less a continent at war and more a continent in collapse. The armies still fought, the cannons still fired, and maps still shifted with every offensive, but beneath that noisy surface, the deeper structures of civilization had already broken down. Nations began to move on instinct rather than vision. Leaders acted not to win the war, but to prevent their societies from disintegrating completely. The turning point of the First World War had matured into something irreversible, a systemic failure that neither courage nor strategy could repair. Germany, sensing this unraveling, oscillated between desperation and denial. Its military leaders still believed that discipline could stave off disaster, but discipline was no longer enough. The spring offensive had consumed the last reservoir of strength, and what followed was a cascading collapse. Your document reflects this in the minor yet devastating details of the German home front. School children fainting from hunger, factory workers stealing coal to heat their apartments, trains arriving hours late because locomotives could not be maintained. These were not anomalies, they were signs of a nation whose infrastructure had been stretched beyond the limits of survival. And as the home front suffered, morale within the army eroded. Soldiers began to speak not of victory, but of endurance, not of honor, but of obligation. They were no less brave than in 1914, but bravery means little when set against exhaustion. Units that once advanced with precision now withdrew in improvisational patterns, forced by circumstances rather than command. The front was no longer a front, it was a membrane, thinning with every passing week. Yet the greatest danger to Germany did not lie in the trenches, but in the streets of its cities. Urban populations, worn down by years of scarcity, began to interpret every rumor as a sign of approaching catastrophe. Workers initiated strikes that grew not only in size but in political meaning. Women protested the rationing of basic goods. Veterans returned from the front only to discover that their families were living in conditions indistinguishable from wartime blockades. A nation that had once boasted of iron discipline was now fraying at every seam. Austria-Hungary's situation was even dire. If Germany was cracking, the Habsburg Empire was shattering. The monarchy had never been a unified state in the modern sense. It was a balancing act among nationalities, languages, religions, and interests. The war transformed this delicate arrangement into a machine of mutual resentment. Your document captures the dissolution vividly. Rail lines occupied by local militias, supply depots seized by ethnic councils, families fleeing from famine-ravaged towns, soldiers refusing orders delivered in unfamiliar languages. By autumn 1918, the empire no longer existed as a functioning entity. Its army was a mosaic of units that obeyed selectively. Its economy was a fossil, incapable of producing or distributing essentials. Its political apparatus was fragmented into regional powers more concerned with independence than with imperial survival. The war did not defeat Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary defeated itself through the inability to reconcile war with diversity. Italy, paradoxically, was the one nation among the original Entente powers that found strength precisely because it had been broken earlier. The trauma of Caporetto had purged illusions and forced the country into a harsh self-awareness. The Piave Line was both a geographic and psychological frontier, a boundary between despair and defiance. In 1918, Italy's military recovery mirrored its social recovery. Civilians grew more unified. Politicians, fearful of public collapse, temporarily set aside rivalries. The army reorganized itself with a discipline born from necessity. Your document points to this phenomenon indirectly, noting how Italian morale seemed steadier in 1918 than in the years preceding the disaster. France and Britain approached the war's end with exhausted confidence. They had survived the darkest periods, Verdun, the mutinies, the Somme, not because they were untouched by crisis, but because their political systems retained enough flexibility to absorb shock. France's resolve came from a sense of defending home soil. Britain's came from a belief in imperial continuity. Both nations held on long enough for the United States to transform the strategic equation. For the Americans, 1918 was not a year of collapse, but a year of arrival. Your document highlights the extraordinary speed of American mobilization, its industrial output, its financial power, its ability to move men across oceans with logistical precision. This was not the exhausted contribution of an overstretched nation, but the confident stride of a rising power. American troops entered the war at a moment when European armies were brittle, and their presence reshaped the psychological landscape. Their health, their enthusiasm, their sheer numbers became symbols that Europe's old order could not ignore. For many civilians, watching American units march through French towns felt like witnessing the rebirth of hope. This contrast between nations collapsing and a nation ascendant reshaped the final campaigns. The Allied offensives were not simply better coordinated, they were fueled by the knowledge that time had finally turned in their favor. The 100 Days Offensive demonstrated what happens when an exhausted enemy faces a coalition that has regained initiative. Every mile gained weakened Germany disproportionately. Every German retreat accelerated the decay of its already failing systems. In your document, there is a striking passage, a report describing how German soldiers, once renowned for organization, began abandoning equipment they could no longer carry, knowing that they neither had the logistics to retrieve it nor the strength to fight for the territory it defended. This is the essence of collapse, not as a dramatic event but as a slow abandonment of the structures that make war possible. When war outpaces a nation's ability to supply, maintain, and justify it, retreat becomes not a tactic but an inevitability. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary faced its final reckoning. Its front disintegrated not through military defeat alone, but through desertion and mutiny, driven by famine and nationalism. The Italian advance at Vittorio Veneto was not merely a tactical success, it was the final collapse of an empire that had run out of identity. The soldiers who surrendered did so not as Austro-Hungarians, but as Czechs, Croats, Poles, Slovenes, and Hungarians, nationalities reclaiming themselves from an empire that had demanded their lives but could no longer offer meaning. The Ottoman Empire, too, approached its end. Though your document touches less on this theater, the dynamic was similar. Shortages, military exhaustion, and internal fragmentation produced a war effort that crumbled under Allied advances. Bulgaria collapsed even earlier, its defeat sending tremors through the Central Powers Alliance structure. By late October 1918, Germany stood alone. The empire that had hoped to dominate Europe now faced the reality of political implosion. Workers' councils emerged. Soldiers' councils appeared in garrisons. The Navy mutinied rather than sail on a final suicidal mission. What began as isolated unrest transformed rapidly into revolution. The Kaiser's authority evaporated, ministers resigned, provinces declared autonomy, Berlin itself filled with demonstrations demanding peace. The turning point of the First World War was complete long before the armistice. It lay in this shift from military logic to social inevitability. Once the people no longer believed in the war could no longer sustain itself. It didn't matter how brave the soldiers were or how skillfully the generals planned, a modern war is a contract between armies and societies, and by 1918, every society in the Central Powers had voided that contract. The guns would soon fall silent, but silence, when it came, would reveal a world that no longer resembled the one that had marched so confidently into war 4 years earlier. By the time the armistice approached, the war no longer resembled the conflict that had begun in August 1914. It had expanded beyond strategy, beyond territory, beyond the ambitions of generals. What now unfolded was a social and civilizational landslide, an entire world order sliding downward under its own unbearable weight. The armies kept fighting because the machine of war had its own momentum, but the nations behind them had begun to dissolve into uncertainty. The turning point of the First World War was not the final offensive. It was the moment when the structures that once gave meaning to war, empire, monarchy, authority, hierarchy, started to collapse faster than any battlefield line. Germany's revolution did not arrive suddenly. It seeped upward from food riots, from factory strikes, from soldiers' mutterings in dugouts and barracks. Your document's references to rising unrest and the emergence of workers' councils offer a glimpse of the political fever spreading through the empire. The German state had long maintained an image of iron discipline, but discipline cannot survive on an empty stomach. By autumn 1918, even the army, traditionally the most loyal pillar of the Kaiserreich, felt the tremors. Soldiers wrote letters describing their reluctance to fight. Units obeyed commands with diminishing conviction. Rumors circulated that the monarchy sought a final suicidal naval engagement, and when sailors realized the truth, they mutinied. This mutiny was not merely a refusal of orders, it was the cracking of the empire's spine. As the naval revolt spread inland, the government could no longer pretend that the war was under control. Cities erupted with demonstrations, and banners demanding peace replaced the patriotic flags that had once filled the same streets. The revolution was not ideological, it was existential. People no longer sought victory, they sought escape. The pressure that had built for 4 long years burst open, revealing a society that had been held together not by unity, but by fear and inertia. Once that grip loosened, the movement toward revolution became unstoppable. Austria-Hungary's collapse was even more dramatic, though less violent. The empire simply could not hold its mosaic of peoples together any longer. The document's references to ethnic councils, regional administrations, and local seizures of authority illustrate how the imperial center lost leverage over the periphery. The Habsburg state had always ruled through compromise, but compromise requires shared resources, and by 1918 there were none. Famine erased loyalty. Scarcity accelerated nationalism. Political leaders in Prague, Zagreb, Krakow, and Ljubljana saw opportunity where Vienna saw only crisis. When each group declared autonomy or independence, the empire disintegrated not like a building imploding, but like ice melting, quietly, inevitably, irreversibly. Italy's final offensive at Vittorio Veneto was, in this context, less a decisive military operation than the final push against an empire already hollowed by internal decay. Italian troops fought fiercely, but much of their success came from the Habsburg army's disintegration behind the front. Soldiers surrendered not because they were defeated in combat, but because they no longer recognized the authority giving them orders. In your document, the descriptions of returning Italian morale, rebuilt after Caporetto's trauma, highlight how societies rebound when given a chance, whereas others simply collapse under accumulated strain. While the Central Powers unraveled, the Allied nations experienced an inverse transformation. Their populations remained exhausted, their armies depleted, but the sense of impending victory replaced fear with momentum. This psychological shift mattered enormously. A society that believes it is winning can tolerate hardship longer than one that fears collapse. France and Britain were worn thin, yet they moved forward with a clarity that comes only when the end of suffering is in sight. The arrival of American forces amplified that sense of inevitability, not merely through numbers, but through energy. The Americans represented a future that had not yet been touched by European cynicism, a future that believed wars could still have purpose. Your document captures this contrast through the lens of material abundance versus material absence. While the Central Powers struggled to supply bread, Allied forces consumed American wheat. While German factories slowed, American factories accelerated. While Austro-Hungary rationed soap and heat, the United States debated how much of its surplus to ship overseas. The imbalance was not simply logistical, it was symbolic. Europe's old order was dying, and a new industrial world was taking its place. This moment also exposed the fragility of states that had relied on imperial authority rather than democratic legitimacy. Britain, though exhausted, maintained social cohesion through parliamentary processes. France, though traumatized, retained national unity through its republican tradition. The United States, though new to the war, reinforced its domestic stability through civic mobilization. In contrast, Germany and Austria-Hungary, states bound by dynasties rather than consent, found their political foundations crumbling once the illusion of strength faded. The war revealed that modern societies cannot be governed by old formulas under modern pressures. The Ottoman Empire, though less central to your document, followed a similar pattern of unraveling: military defeats, famine, ethnic fractures, administrative paralysis. Bulgaria had already fallen. The alliance that once envisioned a continent rebuilt under its dominance now collapsed one nation at a time, each succumbing to its own internal weaknesses. By November 1918, the Central Powers no longer possessed agency. Events carried them, rather than the other way around. Germany sought an armistice because its cities were days from famine. Austria-Hungary ceased to exist because its constituent nations abandoned it before it could abandon them. The Ottomans accepted defeat to avoid further disintegration. The collapse was not negotiated, it was acknowledged. What makes this stage of the war so revealing is that the fighting itself remained ferocious until the very last hour. Soldiers died on November 11th, sometimes in offensives launched that same morning, long before the political decisions had been made. The armies fought because the machinery of war could not stop instantly. The human cost of that final persistence underscores the tragic disconnect between military operations and political reality. The turning point had passed, but the war had to complete its own ritual of exhaustion before silence could return. And when silence finally did return, it revealed the enormity of the transformation that had taken place. Europe had not been defeated by a superior enemy. It had been defeated by its own contradictions. Empires too fragile to sustain modern conflict, ideologies too rigid to adapt, societies too strained to endure another winter. The end of the war did not feel like a triumph. It felt like a release from something that had gone on too long. The turning point of the First World War by late 1918 was fully realized. Victory belonged not to the boldest strategy or the most heroic army, but to the system that endured longest. And endurance in a modern industrial war depends not on tradition or aristocracy, but on resources, cohesion, and belief. The war was nearly over, but the consequences of this collapse were only beginning. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the silence was not victorious. It was hollow, uneasy. The silence of a continent that had been emptied of illusions and strength alike. The end of the First World War did not feel like the closing of a chapter. It felt like a collapse into an unknown future. The war had not been won in the traditional sense. It had simply exhausted itself. The turning point had come long before the armistice, when the internal logic of the conflict had broken down and societies discovered that they could no longer sustain the gargantuan machinery they had built. In the immediate aftermath, Europe confronted a paradox that your document captures in its descriptions of civilian suffering. The war ended, but deprivation did not. German cities still faced shortages. Austrian markets remained bare. Italian towns struggled to regain normalcy. The armistice did not restore prosperity. It merely halted the drain. A continent that had sacrificed generations, industries, and entire political systems now found itself with the vague and disorienting task of rebuilding a world it no longer understood. Germany entered this phase in a state of political freefall. The revolution that had erupted before the armistice did not calm upon peace, it accelerated. Workers' councils attempted to impose authority where old imperial structures had dissolved. Soldiers returned home to cities governed by competing ideologies. Radical factions seized buildings, declared councils, issued proclamations. And yet most people desired nothing ideological. They desired stability, bread, heat, and normalcy. This gap between political fever and social exhaustion created a fragile environment that would define Germany's entire post-war existence. Your document's references to inflation, unemployment, and the disorientation of returning veterans highlight a deeper truth. The German defeat was not merely military, it was existential. The society that had been promised strength, victory, and destiny now had to absorb the shock of total reversal. Many felt, as noted in writings of the time, that they had been betrayed, not by enemies abroad, but by leaders at home. This sentiment would become one of the most poisonous legacies of the war, a seed planted in hunger and humiliation. Austria-Hungary did not even have the luxury of confronting defeat as a singular nation. The empire fractured instantly into successor states, each claiming sovereignty over its territory, each inheriting the burdens of war without the structure to manage them. The collapse was not followed by liberation, but by confusion. Cities found themselves suddenly part of new nations they had never imagined. Borders were drawn rapidly, sometimes arbitrarily. Ethnic tensions that had simmered beneath imperial suppression now exploded into open conflict. Hunger did not diminish because the empire fell. It intensified because the centralized systems that had barely functioned now ceased to function entirely. For Italy, the war's end was bittersweet. On paper, it was among the victors. In reality, it emerged battered, its economy shattered, its cities strained, its political system weakened by years of infighting and public disillusionment. The trauma of Caporetto remained embedded in the national psyche, mixed with the frustration that Italy had bled heavily and yet felt under-recognized at the peace table. In your document, the grievances of refugees, the bitterness over shortages, and the rising social agitation foreshadow the instability that would soon fuel radical politics. Italy had survived the war, but not the social fractures it revealed. France faced a different burden, victory that felt indistinguishable from mourning. No nation had suffered so extensively on its own soil. Whole regions had been erased, villages depopulated, landscapes turned into wastelands of shell craters and twisted metal. The end of the war brought relief, yes, but also the painful task of confronting loss at a scale that defied comprehension. In your document, even references to administrative reports carry an undertone of exhaustion, officials calculating damages, planning reconstruction, dealing with vast numbers of wounded and displaced people. A nation victorious in arms now faced a generational task of rebuilding, physical, economic, and emotional. Britain, though spared the destruction of its own territory, emerged from the conflict financially strained and psychologically altered. The war had shaken its imperial confidence. It had revealed the limits of its autonomy, the vulnerabilities of its global networks, and the dependence it now had on allies outside Europe. The societal shifts that began during wartime, women entering the workforce, workers organizing for rights, political parties redefining themselves, did not fade with peace. The Britain that emerged was no longer the Britain of 1914. The empire remained vast, but the sense of inevitability about its destiny had evaporated. And in the United States, the war's end marked not a moment of relief, but a moment of awakening. America had fought for a little over a year, yet it emerged as the world's creditor, industrial leader, and arbiter of diplomacy. The contrast highlighted in your document between European scarcity and American abundance now translated into geopolitical power. While Europe limped into peace, America strode into it. This imbalance would reshape the political architecture of the 20th century. But perhaps the most profound transformation was not political or economic, it was conceptual. The war changed how societies imagined themselves and their place in the world. Empires that defined identity for centuries disappeared. Nationalism surged in territories once governed by monarchies. Ideologies, communism, fascism, radical populism found fertile ground in the ruins. Your document captures this subtly, in the bitterness of civilians, in the fragmentation of states, in the sense of disillusionment expressed indirectly through complaints about bread, clothing, shortages, and the inability to go on. At its heart, the turning point of the First World War was the recognition that modern conflict had outgrown the political systems that attempted to manage it. Monarchies could not sustain industrial warfare. Empires could not survive simultaneous internal diversity and total mobilization. Societies built on rigid hierarchies could not withstand the democratic pressures unleashed by mass armies and mass suffering. The war did not merely end political systems, it revealed their obsolescence. And yet, even as Europe faced its own ruins, it inherited something else, the awareness that the world had entered a new era, one shaped by machines, by mass production, by global networks, by ideological passions. The war had destroyed the 19th century. It had created the 20th. When the armistice came, people expected peace to descend like a balm. Instead, peace felt like an exposed wound. What collapsed in 1918 was not only armies, it was certainty itself, and the consequences of that collapse were only beginning to unfold. In the aftermath of 1918, Europe stepped into a world both liberated and wounded, a world reshaped not by victory, but by exhaustion. The First World War did not end with the triumph of one ideology over another, nor with the clear defeat of a villainous empire. It ended because the societies that sustained the conflict simply ran out of the capacity to continue. The true turning point had occurred long before the armistice. The final act was merely a confirmation of collapse. And in that collapse lay the origins of a new, unstable century. In the months following the armistice, the scale of the devastation began to reveal itself. Cities were hollowed, economies paralyzed, families broken by loss so vast that grief became a shared identity. Your documents detailed references to shortages, inflation, displaced civilians, and abandoned towns capture a Europe that resembled more a continent of refugees than a constellation of nations. Peace had arrived, but stability had not. The war's end left millions asking not how to rebuild the world, but how to endure it. Germany, stripped of its monarchy and political coherence, faced the deepest reckoning. The revolution that preceded the armistice did not resolve its internal fractures, it exposed them. Competing visions for Germany's future collided in the vacuum left by imperial collapse. Workers' councils attempted to enact radical reforms. Veterans groups demanded revenge or restoration. Middle-class families, haunted by scarcity, yearned for order. Industrialists feared nationalization. Radicals feared reaction. The Weimar Republic emerged not as a product of unity, but as a compromise forged in desperation. Your document's emphasis on economic fragility, hyperinflation's early rumblings, unemployment, and the scarcity of basic goods foreshadows what Germany would soon become, a society searching for meaning in the ruins, fertile ground for both creativity and extremism. The myth of betrayal, born from humiliation and hunger, grew silently in the national psyche. The war had ended, but its unresolved resentments would become the political accelerants of a darker era. Austria-Hungary, now gone, left behind a scattering of successor states grappling with the burdens of independence. Czechoslovakia sought to balance diversity with democracy. Hungary plunged into chaos and counter-revolution. Yugoslavia struggled to unite peoples who had fought each other months earlier. Austria itself, stripped of empire, found its future uncertain, reduced to a small republic haunted by memories of imperial grandeur. The collapse of the Habsburg world was not a single event, but a continuing unraveling. Borders shifted, economies staggered, ethnic rivalries surfaced. The war's end did not simplify Central Europe, it fragmented it into unstable pieces. Italy, though on the victorious side, experienced a victory so hollow that it felt like another form of defeat. Your document's descriptions of anger, deprivation, and political polarization show how deeply the Italian public felt betrayed, first by the disaster at Caporetto, then by the perceived injustices of the peace negotiations. This sense of humiliation, combined with economic hardship and returning soldiers who could not find work, created conditions that made radical solutions seem appealing. Italy's wounds did not heal. They festered, and in those wounds lay the roots of a future authoritarianism. France and Britain faced a different challenge, managing victory without collapsing under its weight. France had suffered more physical destruction than any other Allied power. It emerged victorious, but scarred. A nation haunted by empty villages, destroyed industries, and the immeasurable psychological burden of sacrifice. Britain, though spared the devastation of its own soil, faced staggering debts, a transformed workforce, and a population permanently marked by the scale of loss. Both nations believed they had won a war to end all wars. Both would soon discover that the peace they forged was built on unstable compromises. And then there was the United States, stepping into the post-war world with confidence born of distance, resources, and relative stability. American economic and political power had grown during the conflict, and its influence shaped every major decision at the peace table. Yet, even here, your document hints at an underlying tension, the gap between America's newfound global role and its domestic reluctance to accept long-term responsibility. The war had thrust the United States onto the world stage, but its society remained uncertain whether it wanted to remain there. This tension would define the decades to come. For all nations, the deeper consequence of 1918 was conceptual. The war transformed the way people understood power, society, identity, and vulnerability. It exposed the fragility of empires and the volatility of nationalism. It revealed how modern economies could collapse under the pressure of total war, how propaganda could mobilize entire populations, and how fear could reshape political landscapes. It demonstrated that industrial conflict was not a temporary aberration, but the new logic of global competition. The turning point of the First World War was therefore not a battle nor a treaty, but a realization that the 19th century world had died, and something far more unpredictable had taken its place. The systems that once held nations together, dynasty, hierarchy, tradition, imperial unity, proved incapable of managing the demands of modernity. In their place emerged ideologies that promised renewal: socialism, fascism, communism, radical nationalism. Each grew from the same soil of disillusionment that your document captures in the voices of refugees, widows, workers, and soldiers. The war left behind a world hungry for meaning, yet wary of promises. Millions sought stability as a refuge from chaos, but stability was no longer easy to find. Borders were redrawn without certainty. Governments rose without legitimacy. Society searched for identity while mourning the past. Europe had ended a war, only to discover that it had begun an era. And this is the final irony of the First World War's turning point. The very forces that ended the conflict, exhaustion, collapse, disintegration, also created the conditions for the next great calamity. The war revealed that modern societies could be mobilized to extraordinary levels of sacrifice, but it also showed how quickly they could fracture under pressure. It taught nations that victory could be meaningless without stability, and that defeat could be weaponized into political resentment. It demonstrated that power no longer belonged to empires, but to states capable of harnessing industry, ideology, and mass emotion. When Europe emerged from the war, it did so with the haunted awareness that nothing had been resolved. The guns had stopped, but the tremors beneath the continent had not. The future would not resemble the past. It would be shaped by the contradictions the war had exposed but not resolved. The First World War's turning point was not a moment. It was a process of a slow collapse of old structures, a crisis of endurance, a shift in global balance, and a transformation of social consciousness. The armistice ended the fighting, but it did not end the forces the war had unleashed. And so the final lesson of 1918 is a quiet, unsettling one. Wars end not when peace arrives, but when societies break. Europe broke first, and the century that followed would be built from its fractures.